When British commanders looked across the English Channel in June 1944, they knew instantly this war had changed forever. When British commanders finally stood on the southern coast of England in the early days of June 1944 and looked out across the Channel, what they saw was not merely a fleet, but a transformation of the war itself. For years, Britain had stood as a fortress under siege, absorbing blows, rationing resources, and fighting a global war with limited manpower and finite industrial capacity. Now, before their eyes, lay a sight so vast that it challenged their understanding of what modern warfare had become. The sea was no longer open water. It was crowded, layered, alive with motion. Ships stretched to the horizon in every direction, their silhouettes overlapping until it became impossible to count them. Landing craft bobbed beside destroyers, troop transports, tank carriers, supply ships, hospital vessels, and naval escorts of every size and description. For many British officers, hardened by years of combat and responsibility, the moment carried a weight they would remember for the rest of their lives. The British Army had entered the war in 1939 as a professional force shaped by imperial policing and limited continental engagements. By 1940, it had suffered near-catastrophic defeat in France and evacuation of Dunkirk. The years that followed were marked by defensive strategy, attritional campaigns in North Africa, hard fighting in Italy, and constant anticipation of a return to Northwest Europe. That return had been discussed, postponed, revised, and debated at the highest levels of Allied command. British commanders understood better than anyone the cost of a failed amphibious assault. Dieppe had proven that bravery without overwhelming force led only to slaughter. As a result, British planning culture became cautious, methodical, and deeply concerned with logistics and preparation. When American industry entered the war in full force, British officers hoped it would change the equation. What they did not expect was just how completely it would redefine the scale of war. Senior British naval officers were among the first to grasp the magnitude of what was assembling. Admirals who had commanded fleets throughout the Atlantic and Mediterranean now confronted a concentration of sea power unmatched in history. The Royal Navy had ruled the seas for centuries. Yet even its most experienced commanders acknowledged that they had never seen anything remotely comparable. One British admiral later remarked that the Channel looked less like a body of water and more like a vast industrial estate floating on tides and currents. The Americans had not merely supplied ships. They had built entire classes of vessels specifically for invasion warfare, designed for mass production and rapid deployment. Two British eyes, accustomed to carefully preserved capital ships and limited numbers. The American approach appeared almost reckless in its abundance, yet undeniably effective. Army commanders shared a similar sense of astonishment. British generals who had spent years balancing manpower shortages, equipment constraints, and political pressure now watched American divisions arrive with full complements of vehicles, artillery, engineers, and logistical support. The scale of the American buildup in Britain transformed entire regions of the country. Roads were widened, ports expanded, railways reorganized, and airfields multiplied at astonishing speed. British officers visiting American staging areas often noted that the United States seemed to wage war the way it built factories, with efficiency, redundancy, and an assumption that any problem could be solved by producing more. This mindset, initially viewed with skepticism by some British professionals, proved indispensable in the context of a cross-channel invasion. There was also an emotional dimension to the moment. Britain had been alone in 1940, and the memory of that isolation still lingered. When British commanders saw American troops filling camps, ports, and airfields across southern England, it was a visible confirmation that the burden of the war was no longer carried primarily by British shoulders. For officers who had lived through the Blitz and the threat of invasion, the American presence symbolized not only military power but strategic reassurance. The invasion fleet was proof that the balance had shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. British commanders were not naive. They understood that size alone did not guarantee success. German defenses in Normandy were formidable, and the Atlantic Wall, though imperfect, was heavily armed and manned by experienced troops. Weather, tides, and timing introduced variables that could not be fully controlled. Yet as British planners reviewed the final operational orders, many privately acknowledged that no invasion in history had ever been supported by such an overwhelming concentration of force. One British general later reflected that for the first time in the war, failure seemed unlikely not because of courage or skill alone, but because the Allies had assembled more power than the enemy could realistically counter. The cooperation between British and American commanders was critical to this perception. While national differences existed, the months of joint planning under Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, had forged a shared operational language. British officers contributed hard-won experience from earlier campaigns, while American commanders brought confidence rooted in resources and momentum. When British leaders observed the invasion fleet, they were seeing the tangible result of this partnership. The fleet was multinational in composition, but its backbone was unmistakably American, a fact that few British officers disputed, rather than diminishing British contributions. This reality clarified roles and responsibilities in a way that allowed the operation to proceed with clarity and purpose. On the eve of the invasion, some British commanders walked among embarkation points and watched American soldiers board landing craft. Many noted the youth of the troops, their unfamiliar accents, and their apparent confidence. British officers, older on average and shaped by years of war, saw in these men a combination of optimism and determination that was both inspiring and sobering. The Americans were entering their first major battle against German forces in Western Europe. British commanders understood that their own responsibility was not only to fight alongside them, but to ensure that the lessons of earlier failures were not repeated. The naval dimension of the fleet left an especially deep impression. British naval planners had insisted on overwhelming fire support, and what they now saw exceeded even their most ambitious expectations. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were positioned with precision, each assigned specific targets along the coast. The Americans had brought with them a level of naval gunfire capacity that turned entire stretches of shoreline into planned zones of destruction. British commanders understood that this firepower would save lives on the beaches, and many later credited it as a decisive factor in overcoming German resistance during the critical first hours. Air power added yet another layer to the spectacle. From the perspective of British commanders, the sky above southern England had become a continuous flow of aircraft. Transport planes, bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft moved with clockwork regularity. The Americans had not only added numbers, but had helped create a system in which air superiority was assumed rather than contested. British officers who had fought under hostile skies earlier in the war now operated in an environment where Allied aircraft dominated day and night. The invasion fleet below was protected by a shield of air power that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. As the fleet sailed, British commanders monitored reports and communications with intense focus. When news arrived that landings were underway, reactions were measured but resolute. There was no celebration, only concentration. Yet in private moments, many British officers acknowledged that the sight of the fleet had already answered the most troubling question they carried: whether the Allies had truly assembled enough strength to break into Fortress Europe. The answer, visible in steel and smoke and motion, was unmistakable. In the days following the landings, British commanders assessed the unfolding battle through the lens of what they had witnessed before D-Day. When difficulties arose, they were not surprised. When progress was slow, they remained confident. The constant flow of reinforcements, supplies, and equipment from the sea validated their earlier impressions. The invasion was not a single gamble but a sustained industrial operation. American logistics ensured that setbacks could be absorbed and momentum restored. British officers, long accustomed to fighting with limited reserves, now commanded forces that could adapt, reinforce, and advance. Continuously. In later years, when British commanders wrote memoirs or gave interviews, the memory of that first sight of the invasion fleet returned again and again. Some described it as humbling, others as reassuring, and some as the moment they truly believed the war in Europe would be won. They spoke of it not in abstract strategic terms, but as a physical experience. The noise of engines, the smell of fuel and salt air, the endless lines of ships moving with deliberate purpose. It was the moment when planning became reality, and when years of endurance gave way to decisive action. What British commanders said, and later wrote, about America's D-Day fleet reveals more than admiration for size and strength. It reveals an understanding that modern war had entered a new phase, one defined by industrial scale, coalition warfare, and logistical dominance. The fleet symbolized not only American power, but the unity of Allied purpose. For Britain, it marked the transition from survival to victory. For the commanders who witnessed it, the sight remained etched in memory as the clearest sign that the long road from Dunkirk was finally leading home. In the weeks that followed the landings, British commanders continued to reflect on what the invasion fleet had represented at the moment it appeared before them. As the battle for Normandy settled into a grinding struggle through hedge villages and fortified towns, the memory of that fleet remained a psychological anchor. Whenever progress slowed or casualties mounted, commanders reminded themselves that the sea behind them was still filled with ships, still delivering men, fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements in quantities that Germany could not hope to match. This understanding shaped British operational thinking throughout the campaign. Unlike earlier offensives, where setbacks might force a pause or reconsideration, Normandy was fought with the confidence that time favored the Allies. British field commanders quickly recognized that the American logistical system had altered the traditional rhythm of warfare. In previous campaigns, British units had often advanced cautiously, mindful that overextension could result in supply shortages or isolation. In Normandy, that fear was largely absent. Supplies flowed continuously from the beaches, through artificial harbors, and along newly built roads. British officers who had once counted artillery shells and fuel reserves now planned operations with the expectation that resupply would arrive as needed. This shift did not make them reckless, but it allowed them to think on a larger scale, coordinating attacks across wider fronts and over longer periods. Naval commanders, too, continued to draw lessons from the fleet they had witnessed. The sustained naval presence off the Normandy coast remained a powerful tool throughout the campaign. British admirals noted that the invasion fleet was not a one-day phenomenon but a persistent extension of land power. Ships repositioned, guns recalibrated, and fire missions adjusted as the front lines moved inland. The idea that sea power could so directly shape a land battle reinforced doctrines that would influence British military thinking long after the war ended. For many officers, Normandy demonstrated that naval supremacy was not merely about controlling trade routes or blockading enemies, but about enabling decisive action on land. The relationship between British and American commanders deepened as the campaign progressed. Initial cultural differences gave way to mutual respect, forged in shared hardship. British officers observed that American commanders adapted quickly to the realities of combat, shedding early assumptions and learning from experience. At the same time, Americans increasingly valued British caution and experience, particularly in complex operations involving coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. The invasion fleet had been the physical symbol of American power, but the fighting that followed revealed the necessity of British experience in translating that power into effective action. Privately, some British commanders admitted that the sight of the fleet had forced them to reconsider long-held assumptions about warfare and empire. Britain had once relied on naval dominance and limited expeditionary forces to maintain global influence. The D-Day fleet demonstrated that the future belonged to nations capable of mobilizing entire societies and industries for war. This realization was sobering but also clarifying. British leaders understood that the post-war world would be shaped by such capabilities, and that the Anglo-American partnership would be central to maintaining stability in that new order. As reports arrived from the front lines, British commanders often contrasted the present campaign with earlier phases of the war. In North Africa, progress had been uncertain and reversible. In Italy, terrain and German defenses had imposed a slow, costly advance. Normandy was different. Although fighting was fierce and casualties high, the strategic trajectory was unmistakable. Each day brought more Allied troops ashore, more vehicles into action, and more pressure on German forces. The invasion fleet ensured that losses could be replaced and momentum sustained. For British officers who had spent years fighting limited wars with constrained means, this represented a fundamental shift. Air commanders also reflected on the significance of the fleet in broader strategic terms. The success of the landings confirmed that air superiority, combined with naval and ground power, could achieve what had once seemed impossible. British air officers noted that the invasion fleet functioned as both a beneficiary and an enabler of air dominance. Aircraft protected the ships, while the ships enabled airfields to be built on the continent, extending Allied reach deeper into occupied Europe. This integration of domains reinforced the belief that modern warfare demanded unified command and joint operations on an unprecedented scale. In conversations recorded after the war, British commanders frequently described the invasion fleet as a turning point not only in the campaign but in their own understanding of victory. Many had endured years of uncertainty when survival itself had been in question. The fleet represented certainty. It was evidence that the Allies had crossed a threshold beyond which defeat was unlikely. This certainty did not eliminate fear or loss, but it provided a strategic confidence that sustained commanders through difficult decisions and heavy casualties. The German response further validated British assessments. Intelligence reports indicated that German commanders were overwhelmed by the scale of the invasion and struggled to determine where to concentrate their forces. British officers understood that deception operations had played a role, but they also believed that the sheer size of the Allied force made effective German countermeasures impossible. Even if German units achieved local successes, they could not reverse the overall tide. The invasion fleet ensured that any gap would be filled, any setback answered with renewed pressure. As the Allies broke out of Normandy and advanced toward Paris, British commanders looked back on the days before D-Day with a sense of grim satisfaction. The planning debates, the delays, the compromises, and the patience required to assemble the fleet now appeared justified. The Americans had delivered what they promised. Not just participation, but overwhelming commitment. British officers, while proud of their own forces, acknowledged that without American industry and manpower, the invasion might have failed or been postponed indefinitely. In the years after the war, as Britain reassessed its role in the world, the memory of the invasion fleet remained central to military education and historical reflection. Staff colleges studied Operation Overlord as a case study in coalition warfare, logistics, and command. British instructors emphasized that the fleet symbolized the necessity of alliances and the limits of national power when faced with global conflict. The lesson was clear. Modern wars could not be won alone. For the men who had stood on the coast and watched the fleet assemble, these lessons were personal rather than theoretical. They remembered the sound of engines, the dense formations of ships, and the realization that the war had reached a decisive moment. Many later said that it was then, before a single soldier set foot on French soil, that they believed victory was inevitable. Not easy, not quick, but inevitable. In that sense, what British commanders said when they finally saw America's D-Day fleet was less about words and more about understanding. The fleet spoke for itself. It spoke of industrial power, of political will, of shared sacrifice, and of a future shaped by cooperation rather than isolation. It marked the moment when Britain's long resistance merged into a collective offensive capable of ending the war. For those who witnessed it, the sight remained one of the defining experiences of their lives, a moment when history turned not with a single act of heroism, but with the steady movement of thousands of ships toward a hostile shore. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, British commanders increasingly understood that what they had witnessed before D-Day was not simply the opening act of a campaign, but the defining expression of a new balance of power within the alliance. The invasion fleet was no longer just a memory from the English coast. It had become the backbone of a living, expanding military system. Ports were captured, roads were repaired, railways restored, and the flow of supplies intensified rather than diminished. British officers who'd once feared the fragility of long supply lines now operated within a framework that seemed inexhaustible. Each success reinforced the belief that the industrial depth behind the invasion fleet guaranteed continuity, regardless of tactical setbacks. This realization affected command decisions at every level. British generals became more willing to accept short-term losses in pursuit of long-term objectives, confident that reserves could be replenished. This did not mean a disregard for human life, but rather a strategic confidence that had been absent earlier in the war. The fleet had made it clear that the Allies could absorb blows and still advance. German forces, by contrast, increasingly fought with dwindling supplies and shrinking manpower, a disparity that British commanders noted with growing clarity as the campaign progressed. British reflections on the invasion fleet also extended to leadership and morale. Many commanders observed that the presence of overwhelming American support strengthened not only material conditions, but also the psychological resilience of Allied troops. Soldiers fought with the knowledge that they were part of something vast and unstoppable. British officers, attuned to the importance of morale, recognized that this belief translated into endurance under fire and persistence in difficult terrain. Normandy's hedgerows tested every unit, but the certainty of backing from sea and sky prevented despair from taking hold. Naval commanders continued to emphasize how the fleet altered traditional notions of risk. In earlier wars, committing major fleets to coastal operations carried enormous danger. Losses could be irreplaceable. In Normandy, British admirals acknowledged that American shipbuilding capacity had fundamentally changed that calculus. While losses were mourned, they did not threaten the operation as a whole. The fleet's size and redundancy ensured resilience. This reality reshaped British naval thinking, reinforcing the idea that control of production was as decisive as control of the sea itself. As the Allies liberated Paris and advanced toward Germany, British commanders increasingly framed the invasion fleet as the decisive hinge of the European war. Eastern Front developments were closely followed, but it was clear that the Western Allies now possessed the means to sustain pressure continuously. British officers understood that the fleet had enabled a permanent return to the continent, not a raid or temporary loss. That permanence distinguished Normandy from all previous attempts to confront Germany in the West. In post-war assessments, British military thinkers repeatedly returned to the moment the fleet was first seen. They described it as a revelation, a confirmation that the war had entered an irreversible phase. Some admitted that until then, they had carried private doubts about whether Britain could endure another year, or whether political pressures might force a negotiated settlement. The fleet dispelled those doubts. It demonstrated commitment at a level that made compromise unnecessary and victory attainable. The invasion fleet also became a reference point in discussions about alliance dynamics. British commanders were candid in acknowledging that leadership within the coalition was shifting. While Britain retained influence through experience, planning expertise, and global reach, the scale of American power was undeniable. This shift was not resented by most senior officers. Rather, it was accepted as a strategic reality. Many recognized that Britain's survival and ultimate success depended on embracing this partnership fully. The fleet symbolized that partnership more vividly than any treaty or conference ever could. Training institutions in Britain later incorporated these lessons into doctrine. Staff officers were taught that the success of Normandy lay not only in courage or tactical brilliance, but in preparation, industrial coordination, and alliance management. The invasion fleet was cited as proof that modern war was won long before the first shot was fired. British instructors emphasized that commanders must think in terms of systems rather than isolated battles, a lesson learned by watching America transform logistics into a weapon. Personal accounts from British commanders reveal that the memory of the fleet often eclipsed even the fighting itself. Many described combat as chaotic and fragmented, but the fleet as orderly and purposeful. It represented clarity in a war defined by uncertainty. Even years later, when describing their service, British officers returned to that sight as a moment of calm understanding amid chaos. It was the instant when they grasped the scale of Allied intention. As Germany collapsed and the war in Europe ended, British commanders reflected on the invasion fleet with a mixture of pride and realism. Pride in having contributed to its planning and execution, and realism about what it revealed regarding the future of warfare. They understood that Britain's role in the world had changed, but they also recognized that their early resistance and endurance had made the alliance possible. Without Britain's survival in the dark years, the fleet would never have assembled. In the final analysis, what British commanders said when they finally saw America's D-Day fleet was less about praise and more about recognition. Recognition that the war had reached a point where outcomes were determined by collective strength rather than individual heroics. Recognition that the sacrifice of earlier years had not been in vain. And recognition that history was turning before their eyes. Carried forward not by a single nation, but by a coalition bound together by necessity, resolve, and overwhelming force. The fleet sailed, the armies advanced, and the war moved toward its end. Yet for those British commanders who watched from the shore, the true turning point had already passed. It had arrived quietly, without gunfire, in the form of countless ships waiting for dawn. That sight, more than any victory parade or surrender document, marked the moment they knew the war in Europe would be won.